structure is foundational. Structure is something that a lot of people think about, and also interestingly, that a lot of people will change over time. You might come to your memoir writing in a more chronological order and then decide that you need to blow it apart, which is in fact exactly what I'm doing. I started linearly, chronologically, and it just didn't suit what I'm trying to do. So I'm starting over with a fragmented structure. And many of you may decide that you're doing something similar. Now, these are some of the structures that Linda Joy Myers and I wrote in Breaking Ground on Your Memoir, which is a book that we published several years ago. But memoir is a constantly evolving form, which is what's so exciting about it. It's why we love it. And because of that, I've identified additional common memoir structures that I've been seeing emerge. And I'm sure there are others. I don't think that this is a comprehensive list, and I think you can get creative. And also, we use different terminology. If you read about structure online, you may see some things that are not on this list. But I do want to go through these briefly. So, the linear chronological structure is somewhat straightforward, right? It's a linear journey. It's told in real time. You, the protagonist, are usually placing yourself in that time period. You are in that scene as that age. So it's not a journey of telling from the now. It's not today, 2023, writing a story of what happened then, but rather your protagonist is embodying that time, whatever it may be. The framed memoir is usually a shorter time period. So oftentimes the reason it's called a frame is because it's kind of boxed in a sense. You may decide, I'm going to write 1 year. Maybe there's a travel journey, but you want that travel journey to be informed by your backstory. So this is for those of you who have a lot of childhood memories, perhaps, or just scenes from earlier in your life that are working truly to inform that front story. So the travel narrative, for instance, Linda Joy and I always use Wild as the famed example of the framed memoir, because in Wild, she's on a 3-month journey. But for anyone who's read that book, you know that she uses all kinds of scenes from her backstory, from her upbringing with her mother, from her marriage and her divorce, to inform us, why are we on this journey in the first place? So without those backstories, all Wild would be the Pacific Crest Trail. And of course, it's much, much more than that. So that's a structure that you might use, kind of a condensed narration, and inform that front story with backstory. The braided narrative is when you have two separate timelines. So that's going to really appeal to those of you who feel like there's some competition going on. And I mean healthy, good competition, but perhaps you have two strong narrative voices. One is older and one is younger, necessarily. And so if you do this, the braided memoir can be a really beautiful structure, because it can be usually an adult child, and the child may be adolescent, but adult child, alternating, usually chapters. Every other chapter is a different voice. And in media res, which we in our book called circular, the reason being because when you start in media res, in the midst of things, it usually is a kind of circular narration, in the sense that you're going to come back around. If you start in the middle of the action, and you may start in the middle of the action regardless, but the circular narration style is that there's an inciting event, something happens, and then you kind of weave this story around and then come back to the inciting incident again later. So it almost has a kind of repetitious aspect to it, but it can be a really powerful format, particularly if you have something very striking, that's at the center of your narrative, that is a catalyst that you keep coming back to. The thematic or associative memoir, the reason that I have both of these here together is that associative is a style of kind of choosing the scenes that best support the story that you want to tell. And they usually are, almost by definition, therefore thematic. So if you have a very thematic story, you're writing about addiction, for instance, and everything circles addiction. Or I remember a She Writes author who wrote specifically about love addiction. And that was kind of interesting because love addiction in her adult life was informed by love, like absence of love in her childhood. She did not get the love that she needed in her family of origin, and then that created a love addiction in her adult life. And so the associative nature of that means that you're choosing scenes that always are through the lens of whatever your primary theme might be. These were just some other structures that I've been thinking about a lot lately. The fragmented, which has overlays and similarities, I guess I would say, to the associative, because it really is just choosing these ideas, picking a scene and following the thread of what needs to come next. And it's not necessarily in chronological order. What I will say about these kinds of stories is that your timeline and your timing matter a lot. You really need to track time, or your reader will get confused and lost. So I'm going to actually choose time as a future little craft chat because I think it's so important. Verse is what it sounds like. If you're a poet and you want to give it a go and try a memoir in verse, wonderful. But maybe you have a chapter in verse. Maybe it's just something that you try on and see how it feels in the context of your story. And that could be an interesting way to implement verse if you are someone who leans towards poetry. And then finally, essays. Memoir and essays is a really popular form. So if you are an essayistic writer and you want to compile your book into a book of essays, I want to certainly encourage that. Usually that is going to fall underneath the umbrella of thematic, because you need something that's going to hold those essays together. Now, again, this is not a comprehensive list, but I do want to remind all of you that memoir is not autobiography. Autobiography is the story of your whole life, and memoir is the story of a life. It's a compressed period of time. But if you want to write about your whole life, then please choose something like the thematic or the associative or the fragmented that allows you to jump around and choose the meaningful moments. And also just trust yourself, have fun with it, because there's so many different ways that you can go. And as long as it's executed well and you don't lose the reader and you feel good about the structure that you're doing, I think you can do almost anything. It's just that a lot of people get kind of lost and overwhelmed in their own material, and that can result sometimes in feeling overwhelmed and lost in your structure.